So this is a free online session on risk assessment, which is hosted by POW and funded by Arts Council England. And we very much welcome you to the session. And for anyone who doesn't know POW, we are a charity and our work explores issues around feminism, women and girls, and our events are open to everyone. We're providing these continuing professional development events for free as we are passionate about assisting artists to improve their business skills and become professionally successful. Because we want to be a benefit, especially, we've created a short survey, which we're going to pop in the chat there, which we'd like you to fill in at the end if you can. And we'll also put the link to that underneath the YouTube film when this goes up online. So we'd greatly appreciate it if you could fill that in. Darren's going to talk for about an hour, and we're going to have a 20-minute Q&A at the end. Well, there'll be a chance to ask questions, but if you do have questions as we're going along, I'll monitor the chat, so you can always write them in there. And so now I'm delighted to introduce Darryn De La Soul, POW's production manager, who's going to talk to you about risk assessments.
Right, risk assessments. Now, I learned about risk assessment some time ago because I have an NEBOSH certificate, which opened my eyes a bit, because I remember when I was working in an office, you know, many decades ago, and they came around, and I think risk assessments were fairly new, certainly in that environment, and they came around and they risk assessed my stapler. And I was horrified. I just thought, good God, I'm an adult. Why would you need to risk assess my stapler? But in the context of a nursery school, obviously risk assessing a stapler around 3-year-olds is probably a very good idea. So a lot of it's to do with context, and there's two reasons. There's reasons why you would do risk assessments. The main reason is so that you don't kill anyone, really. And then the others, there's lots of sort of legal ramifications about it. Now, risk assessments can be very, very simple, and that's an example of a very valid risk assessment. Extremely simple. There's only 5 things sort of noted on it, but that was for a POW event. I think it was for a talking event, so it wasn't very very long. And then this is another risk assessment. This is a risk assessment for the Exploratorium. Actually, that was quite a big event, and we had so many elements to it that was what my risk assessment ended up looking like. So, they're both completely valid. Hopefully, you'll only have to do one of those. But who knows, sometime in your life you might need to do one of these, because, it depends on what you do in your careers, really. Right, so risk assessments. The question of why you need to do a risk assessment is really important to think about. The main reason is to keep yourself and others safe, particularly in work environments. There's no reason since the Victorian era why you should hurt yourself or die at work. There was a time in history when people constantly got hurt at work, and things were reformed, and now it's absolutely necessary that getting hurt at work is just not a thing anymore. And also, if you attend an event as an audience member, there's absolutely no reason why you should hurt yourself. So the main reason why you do a risk assessment is to keep yourself, your workers, and everybody else safe. You also need to do a risk assessment to comply with the law. If you run a business and you do anything, you sell a product, or you sell anything, or you employ people, there is a legal requirement to do risk assessments. Also, if anything were to happen, if somebody did trip over something and hurt themselves, or something were to happen, the impact on yourself, if you were running the event or it was your business involved, the impact on you would be drastically reduced if you could go, there's my risk assessment, and I did try and keep people safe. So it's actually just a really good thing to have your risk assessment on the back burner. The next question is, who should do the risk assessment? the HSE guidance, HSE is the Health and Safety Executive, their guidance says that it must be done by a competent person. So you don't need any special qualifications, you just need to be generally competent. And it's usually the person with the responsibility for the event or the business, or their representative. So you can actually hire in people to do stuff. If you've got a very, very complex situation, you can hire health and safety people to come and do your risk assessment. But generally, it just needs to be done by the person with their responsibility who is competent or a competent representative. Mostly, I think, with what we do within POW, it's going to be you because it's your responsibility and you're hopefully fairly competent. Now, most venues that you would work with would generally have their own risk assessment. If you, for example, are doing something in the Turner, they're going to have their own risk assessments. If, however, you're doing something in a derelict building, if you're taking over an empty space, being aware that they won't have their own risk assessment and you'll have to risk assess on behalf of that venue. And then you're going to need your own risk assessment to go alongside. For example, I'll use the example of the Turner again. If you're doing something there, they have a certain level of responsibility for anybody who comes into their building. And then you also have a level of responsibility for what you yourself are doing inside that building. Now, where does this risk assessment go? You always need to keep it on file. It can be on paper, but obviously it's much more convenient to keep it electronically so that if anybody asks to see it, you can send it to them. Depending on the kind of event, if it's a very elaborate and event with got a lot of inherent risk involved, definitely keep it on site because you may be questioned about it and you may also need to refer to it, particularly during setups. Like, well, how did we envisage ameliorating any of these risks that are going on? And it's a very good idea to share it with everybody who needs to know. And people who need to know could be the organisers. So Lindsay will hound you for your risk assessment. So you need to share it with us. You really ought to share it with volunteers working with you and certainly fellow exhibitors or other people involved if it's an event with other people involved, with suppliers. So it's a really good idea to share it with everybody who's going to be involved. And for example, you'll find if you were, for example, putting on a music event, you could ask the suppliers for their risk assessment, if people who are supplying PA or lighting, and they'll send it to you and you should send yours to them as well. Now, one of the confusing things about risk assessments is what exactly does risk mean and what does hazard mean? Now, the basic part of risk assessment is based on hazards and then how you make sure that those hazards don't become a risk. So the definition of a hazard is something with the potential to cause harm. Now, that could be pretty much anything. That piece of paper has the potential to cause harm if I were to eat it, or almost everything has the potential to cause harm. So bear that in mind. That that's why they did the risk. They did the stapler when I was working in an office, because it does have a potential to cause harm. I mean, it does require a lot of adult stupidity to cause harm with it, but nevertheless, it has the potential to cause harm. And then risk is the likelihood that that harm will occur and the severity of that harm. So the likelihood, how likely is it that somebody's going to hurt themselves on the stapler? How likely is it that somebody's going to hurt themselves lifting that very heavy sculpture? And then the severity of the harm is how bad is it going to be if you do hurt yourself? If the severity is a paper cut, it's negligible. But if the severity is breaking your back or having permanent back damage because you've lifted something too heavy, then that's very severe. So risk is likelihood multiplied by severity. So that's how you look at your hazards, and you look at the likelihood of that occurring and the severity of the harm should it occur. And that is what your risk rating will be in. We'll go into a little bit more depth later on. So let's think about hazards. again, absolutely anything could probably be a hazard, but the typical examples are fire, electrical shock, anything to do with electricity, manual handling. Manual handling is, you know, picking things up, putting things down, hurting yourself, doing physical things. Slips, trips and falls, this is a big one, and every risk assessment should really start with slips, trips and falls, because, you know, you can trip over anything, coats, bags, unmarked steps, loose tiles. So slips, trips and falls are, just start all your assessments with slips, trips and falls. I can barely say it. And now we have the joy of coronavirus. So that is now definitely a big hazard, and I'll show you an example of a COVID-19 risk assessment that was finally passed by the council at the end. So in the health and safety world, there is what is known as the hierarchy of controls, and this is the aim of controlling these hazards, and there's a hierarchy of things that you need to do. The most effective way of controlling a hazard is to just eliminate it. So is it possible to, if you're going to lift heavy things, can you eliminate that by using a forklift? Or if you work in the house decoration industry, you used to get leaded paint and people suffered from that. So what happened is that lead was just eliminated from paint, so that anybody who now comes and paints and decorates your house, that's the hazard of lead contamination has been eliminated. So that's the most effective way to do it. And if you can eliminate your hazard, do it. Now, often you can't eliminate the hazard. So then the idea is, can you substitute the hazard with something else? Can you use a different product? Can you just do something different so that you're not using the really hazardous thing? And then you go down to engineering controls. So that again would be, can you put a screen up so that if you're using a bandsaw, can you put guards on it? I mean, almost everything now would have a guard on it. If you're using CNC machines, there's usually some kind of screen to make sure that you don't get things hitting you. Then going down to, all those three are fairly effective ways of controlling hazards. When you get to administrative controls, they become less effective, because now we're starting to rely on human behavior. The top three, elimination, substitution, and engineering, is something that's imposed. It's there. You can't really help using it because it's been dictated. But when it comes to things like administrative controls, that's things like changing the way people work. So that would be things like, this kind of, an example would be factory work. If you do this all day in a factory, and you do one movement over and over and over again, you're going to get some kind of physical injury from it. So you would then rotate jobs. So one day you're turning, or for an hour you turn front to the left, and then in the next hour you turn front to the right, or you go and do a completely different job that doesn't require bending at all. However, this does more or less rely on people actually listening to you and doing what they're told. And then we have PPE. We all know what PPE is these days, personal protective equipment. This is the least effective way of controlling a hazard, because it completely relies on the person using it and using it properly. So there's often examples given, people who, you know, when they were having the Ebola crisis, and you saw the nurses and the doctors, they were wearing loads of PPE. So they had the hazmat suit, they had the glass face thing, but it's really difficult to work like that because it's so hot inside and it steams up, and it's, so there's a great temptation for people to just, you know, pull up their sleeves, and then that part of your skin becomes exposed to the hazard. It happens a lot in factory work, where people just become they can't see through their visors because they sweat so much, so they take them off. And that's when you end up losing an eye. So in this hierarchy of controls, it's always, if you can possibly eliminate the hazard, please do, and then go through the steps. And if you're relying on PPE, please realize that PPE is the least effective way of controlling any hazard, just because it relies on a human to do the right thing, and we all know how unreliable humans are at doing that. So now that we've got COVIDs, we can look at some COVID-specific controls, and there's an extra layer in here. So first of all, eliminating exposure, so things like working from home where you can. That is the most effective way of eliminating contact, staying in, don't go out. If you can't do that, if you can't, completely eliminate your meeting, you can substitute it, luckily, with a Zoom meeting, as we are now. The next level would be engineering controls, and that would be putting up screens, having wipes, having everything wiped down in between people coming in. Then you've got the administrative controls, which again start becoming less effective, because now we're talking about signage. Please wash your hands, please do this, please stay 6 feet apart, etc., etc. So this is again starting to rely on people doing the right thing. Again, we've got PPE, which is to protect yourself. So that would be, wearing gloves, masks, etc. And now we also have community protective equipment, which is very similar to the PPE in it, but that's wearing a mask when you go out into another indoor space to protect other people, not just yourself. And again, I'm sure you've all seen people walk around with their masks not covering their nose, or they're trying to speak and you can't hear people through the mask, so they drop the mask so that they can speak. It's like, well, you've just completely eliminated the usage, like the mask is now completely useless. So all of these things are the least effective way of controlling it. In the end, staying at home or doing your meetings or your work on Zoom is much better than trying to go into work and wear a mask, because relying on humans is a hiding to nowhere, really. Right, so let's have a look at some risks. Risk is how likely is it that the hazard is going to cause harm? So let's take the example of electricity. Electricity is always a hazard. However, if you are doing your event or your exhibition or whatever you're doing inside the Turner Contemporary, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have a problem with electricity, because they have their own maintenance protocols. So you could just list electricity as a hazard and go, this is a well-maintained building, so it's a low risk. However, if you are working in a derelict building, as I did a show in Stall 21 a couple of years ago, we actually had to pay vast quantities of money to get the electricity checked, because it had been derelict for several years and there was no guarantee that the electrics, in the end they were fine, so that was £900 well spent, but we had to do it because there was no guarantee that the electricity was going to be safe in the building. And then if you're doing something outdoors and you're using a generator, generators are incredibly safe these days. It's particularly diesel generators. But, if you are using a generator, you need to make sure that it's safe, it's been tested, you've hired it from a reputable firm, and that you've got a fire extinguisher close by, and the right fire extinguisher, which would be foam for a generator, for petrol and diesel, because spraying water on it is not going to help at all. So you can see that electricity as a hazard has various risk levels depending on where you're using this electricity. And then you need to look at how severe that harm is likely to be. So is that harm going to be a minor injury? Are you going to get a bruise from, if it happens, will you get bruised? Will you get a paper cut? As a major injury, are you going to lose a limb? Are you going to lose an eye? And mostly, are you going to die? So again, if you're doing an art exhibition with some photographs framed on the wall, chances are, it's going to be a minor injury, if anything, because maybe a framed item will fall on your toes. But if you are doing a massive sculpture and it's incredibly heavy, there is a chance that in moving it in and out that you'll cause a major injury to somebody, or if it's not well balanced and it falls over, you could really hurt somebody badly. You could even kill somebody if it was heavy enough. So you need to really use your judgment in thinking, well, how badly will somebody be hurt if they get hurt? Now, doing a risk assessment itself is a 5-step process. So this is what you'll do when you actually come to doing your risk assessments. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to look for the hazards. The best way to look for the hazards is to actually go to the place that you're going to do this event or the exhibition or whatever you're doing. You need to go there and walk around it. You need to look for the loose tiles. You need to see where there's no light, and do you need to put in a lamp so that people won't trip over that thing over there. Look for the trip hazards, look for the danger, look for things, nails poking out of floors. I mean, physically walk around the space and have a look. You can also use your imagination and go, okay, so I can imagine that if the room became too crowded, we will have quite a good prospect of spreading coronavirus. So we need to limit the number of people who come in. So there's 2 ways to do it. It is always best to do it in the space, but if you can't physically get in for some reason, or if it's an online event, you know, there's just the small little bit of risk assessment you need to do. For example, Zoom events is the possibility of Zoom bombing, particularly if you're doing LGBTQ stuff or feminist stuff. There's a tendency for Zoom bombers to try and gain access to your meeting, and sometimes it's not very hard. So you could even do a risk assessment for something as simple as a Zoom meeting if it's a high risk category of people involved. So yeah, look for the hazards. That's step 1. Step 2 is you have a little think and you go, who might be harmed and how might they be harmed? So if would a child be hurt by that but an adult wouldn't, for example? So you need to look at who might be harmed and how they might be harmed. And you need to be very careful to think about everybody who might be in the space. So that includes staff, well, yourself, staff, volunteers, general public, any disabled people, pregnant women. You know, are there fumes involved? Is there anything that you should warn pregnant women about? Is there anything that children or young people could be hurt by? For example, if you're using your 15-year-old child to help you shift your exhibition into place, their bodies are not fully formed yet. You've got to be very careful about how much weight they lift. And one very important thing is lone workers. So people who are working alone, that could be people who are invigilating an exhibition. And particularly if people are working alone and they're dealing with money, people become very vulnerable when they're working alone and there's money involved. So you very seldom see a shop with only one person in it, especially a shop that has high turnover cash. Your corner store very seldom has only one person. There's probably, if they look alone, there's probably somebody in the back room as well, because you're incredibly vulnerable when you're alone and with money. So have a really good think about who can be harmed and how they might be harmed. Will they trip? Will they breathe in something they shouldn't breathe in? Is there, especially at night, if you're doing something in the evening, on the high streets of Margate, there's quite a good chance of drunk people coming in, etc., etc. So think about all the possibilities of what could happen. Why are you not? Okay, then think about the jobs that need doing, how these jobs will be done and who will do them. For example, if you're unloading a whole lot of heavy stuff, could you buy a trolley so that if you can't get parking directly outside, that you can actually put everything in a trolley and carry them with you? And I bought a festival trolley quite a few years ago, particularly to go to festivals with, because if you've ever done a camping festival, you know how far the car is from where you camp. But I found it unbelievably useful for events, because you can just dump everything in it and toodle off. And if you need to get rid of trash, you can throw it in the trolley, toodle it off to your car or wherever you're going to dispose of your trash. So yeah, think about what jobs, how they will be done, and who will do them, and try and get the right people into doing the right jobs. The next thing you're going to do is evaluate the risk, and during this evaluation you're going to decide if your existing precautions are adequate or if you need to do more. So the ideal is always to shoot, your aim is to try and make sure that all your risks are low. So if when you've done your evaluation you come up with a medium or a high risk, you need to add some more controls and some more precautions. But I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail later. So once you've done the evaluation, you then need to record the findings. It's no good just doing it in your head, you need to write it down. Even if it's just low risks, please write everything down, because it just shows a level of thoroughness and competence to have everything written down. And you kind of need it if somebody ever wants to ask, or if anything goes wrong, you need it written down. You need to share it with the relevant people, as I said earlier, and definitely keep it on file for a long time. Not only because, I mean, I worked for a while at the Marlow Theatre, and we had a serial demander of risk assessments. There's somebody who would come to loads of shows, and after almost every show, there'd be an email saying, please send me your risk assessment. And you need to be able to do that. Because yeah, people are entitled, if they didn't feel safe in the thing that you're doing, they're entitled to ask. And you just get people who, you know, are serial demanders. But if you can just go, here we go, off you go, it keeps people quiet. Also, next time you do an event, then you've already got a risk assessment that you can then just adjust to the new details. And then the final step in the 5-step process is to review and revise as necessary. So what we mean by this is, if you are reusing an old risk assessment, obviously it's not going to be quite the same as last time, so you need to review it. You also need to review it if there's a big change that happens without much notice. So for example, if you suddenly have new staff, or a pandemic comes along and changes our lives, or if you suddenly have a change in plans, or there's new legislation that you need to take into account. So, for example, I'm going to show you a COVID-19 risk assessment a bit later. Luckily, that was before the restrictions that came in yesterday. So if I was still trying to do that event in the future, I would have to change the entire thing to take into account the new laws and the new situation. So yeah, reviewing and revising is necessary. So just keep it somewhere handy so that you can reuse it next time. And also if something major happens, that you can revise it. Okay, so I'm going to go through step 3, which was evaluating risk in a bit more detail. First thing you need to do is look at the adequacy of your existing controls. Has your electricity been checked by a competent person? Are you using no naked flames? For example, if you had candles in your show, can you replace them with electric candles? There's almost no venue in the world that will allow you to put a show on with actual candles anymore. I know bars do it and restaurants do it, and that's their prerogative, but I don't know of any venue that will allow you, for an exhibition or a show, to have any kind of naked flame. Unless it's really part of the show, in which case you would have to have a mega risk assessment to prove how you're going to stop this from causing troubles. But look, so you can look at your adequate existing control, the adequacy of what you're already doing. You know, you can say, you know, there's very little chance of fire because we've got no naked flames. There's not a lot of chance of somebody hurting their back because it's being hung or brought into the venue by a competent person. You've already put a one-way system in place, so there's an entry and an exit. or there's a route that you follow to go around the exhibition. If your building becomes too full, that you've got an adequate queuing system outside with marks on the pavement so people know where to stand. You'd think people would know by now, but you still need to do it to make sure that you're doing your bit to make sure that people queue correctly. The next step is to estimate the risk. And the idea with this is that you must try and control risks to an acceptable level. Now, for the purposes of what you're doing for power, you probably only need a matrix like this, which is 3 by 3. If you are doing a show that's got aerialists doing trapeze work, you're going to need you probably need a 10 by 10 grid. If, for example, if you think about the petrochemical industry, if they are doing people who risk assess, I don't know, a petrol processing plant, they've probably got 100 by 100 matrix, because there's so much that can go wrong in different levels, etc. But for us, and what we're doing, probably you're going to get away with doing a 3 by 3 matrix. So to read this, we've got likelihood of the hazard occurring on one axis, and we've got the severity of harm on the other. So if it's a low likelihood, and it's only a slight injury, a bruise or a paper cut, then you've got a risk of 1. 1 multiplied by 1 gives you 1. And it's a very low risk, so you just mark it as low risk and, stay aware, keep it in the back of your mind, but you're probably going to be all right. If you have a low likelihood, but if it were to happen, you'd have a serious harm, somebody would lose a limb or an eye, or they'd end up in hospital, then you've got a medium risk. As soon as you've got a medium risk, you need to try and put in another level of control that would then reduce the risk to a low risk. Again, if you've, say, got a high likelihood of something happening, so, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example now, but if you've got a high likelihood of something happening, and if they have a major injury resulting or possibly death resulting from it, you really need to reduce that risk down to at least a medium and preferably a low. So when you're going through all your hazards, you go and say, okay, I think that's got a low likelihood of happening, but actually it's quite serious if it did happen. So now I need to just add another level of control that will bring it down to a low. And if you have anything that comes up as a red or a high risk, you absolutely need to do something about it, particularly, for example, nut allergies. And if you providing food at an event, and you want to provide some, I don't know, pistachio ice cream, that's very high risk for somebody who has a nut allergy. So just don't serve pistachio ice cream, serve strawberry ice cream. So just eliminate the need to even worry about it by just taking it away, and then you go back down to a low risk. Also, if you are serving food, you must have a list of allergens visible, so that anybody who does have any allergies that are not particularly common can check and see what's inside it. Or just have a list of ingredients, much easier. So, next step, introduce further control measures if you need to. Now, is there a major trip hazard, or are wheelchairs going to struggle to get in? If so, put a ramp there. Do you need extra signage to warn people that there's an uneven floor? And I know this sounds a little bit nanny state, but it does actually help, and it gets you out of a pinch if anything does happen. So provide signage to say, low lighting outside. If your event depends on low lighting, you might want to have a little holding area where people who are coming in from the bright sunlight can just stand for 30 seconds while their eyes adjust, and then you let them through to the low light area. Do you need to put hazard tape, high vis? You know, you can buy gaffer tape that is in fluorescent colors. That's very effective and very good. You know, are there any platforms that you need to mark the edges of? Do you need to have face masks handy in case somebody didn't bring their own? Definitely hand sanitizer, just do it. I know it's a cost to you and people should have their own, but just have it. Do you need to introduce railings if you've got a platform that's quite high? Do you need additional fixings if the thing's particularly heavy that you're trying to put up? And now we need to do track and trace. That's really important that you have a list asking for people's name and phone number and email address so that they can be tracked if needs be. You do need to keep that, I think, for 21 days, and then you can get rid of it, but you definitely need to do track and trace these days. And while you're trying to look at your control measures, use the hierarchy of control. And here's the reminder of what the hierarchy of control is. The most effective thing to do is get rid of the thing. Do it differently so you don't have to do it anymore. If you can't get rid of it, substitute it with something safer. Find some kind of engineering control. Can you put up a screen? Can you wipe everything down in between users? Have signage, and then definitely have PPE for yourself and your workers, and provide community protective equipment for people who forget their face masks. Okay, and then the last step is to write it all down. So I'm now going to show you some examples of actual risk assessments. So we're going to start with the POW 2019 opening event. You can see I love doing risk assessments in Google Docs because you don't need, once you've shared them with somebody, they get the updates automatically. You don't have to constantly send them updates. Also, sharing it just means anybody who needs to read it can read it. And what I do is I have tabs down at the bottom where I keep all the risk assessments, and I also keep them with my schedules. So this is a schedule, and the risk assessments that relate to the schedules are there. So I like to keep everything in one document. So the first thing you need to do is have the event and say what the event is, the date, who did the risk assessments, which is generally me in the power department, and what my contact details are. Because if somebody that you've shared this with needs to ask you about it, then they need to be able to contact you. And especially because we always need to share stuff with the venues as well, so they need to know who the contact is for this in particular. Then you need this row which has hazards, who it affects, existing controls. Then you have your risk rating that you do, and then further controls if the risk is medium or high, and then the revised risk rating. So, yay, slips, trips and falls. So this is an easy win. You can always put your slips, trips and falls in. Who it affects? It affects everybody. That's staff. Actually, I might just make this. Can you see? Should I make it a bit bigger?
It's fine, but it could be a bit bigger, I think.
Okay. All right, there we go. Better. So we've got your slips, trips and falls, who's affected, and the existing controls. So in this case, the existing controls is any cables must be taped down. Please, for your own sanity, don't buy the cheapest gaffer tape in the world, and the stuff you get from Screwfix is abominable. I highly recommend buying your gaffer tape from gaffertape.com because it's really good tape. It'll come off your cables again, because a lot of gaffer tape doesn't come off your cables, and it also will actually stick. In this case, we were having children who doing a flash mob, so all their coats and bags were to be stored in the claw in a different room. Power staff and volunteers, our coats and bags were going to be stored in lockers. So we're not, as far as we can, we've controlled, certainly by people participating in the event, that that's what we're doing to stop slips, trips and falls. Easy, low risk rating, done. Fire affects everybody, obviously, and we've thought about it because Turner Contemporary is compliant for fire safety, and they have set evacuation procedures which will be conducted by the staff. So we're not even responsible for the evacuation procedures. That's the Turner Contemporary staff. So that for me is a very low risk. However, if you are not in a building similar to the Turner Contemporary, if you are using a derelict building on the high street, you then become responsible for the evacuation procedures. So you need to have worked out what your evacuation procedures are and have briefed all your staff and volunteers on what to do in case of a fire. Electrical shock, it's whoever's operating the sound systems, and we'll only be using in-house equipment which is properly installed by professionals. There's a few words that are going to get you out of lots of corners. One is competent person. I could have said, operated only by a competent person, or used only by professionals. So yes, that's a really good words to use, as long as it's true, right? Or everything you write down here needs to be true. So that's a low risk. Now for me, at the time there was that artwork, I forget who the artist was, but it was all the brass instruments that was hung in the sunlight. So your risk assessment is not only for hurting people, it's also damaging expensive stuff like an artwork. So for me, that was something I really needed to put in the risk assessment, is because we knew it was going to be quite busy, that the artwork could actually be damaged by just crowds. That would affect the Turner Contemporary, because that would have, if it did get damaged, it would be their insurance who would need to kick in. And of course, the artist might not be best pleased if it gets damaged. So again, we consulted the Turner Contemporary staff, and they were going to rope off the area to prevent the public coming in. I still felt that it was a bit of a medium risk. So we had another level of discussion with the Turner about how to prevent damage, and that their staff were particularly briefed, and that their staff were always on hand in that area to be the authority that would ask people to step away. So that was the only medium risk we had in this, I felt. And then of course we had children aged 8 to 11. I tend to make it a policy not to work with anybody under 18 if I can possibly help it, because there's a whole other level of protection you need to have in place for children. But we were lucky that the flash mob was organised and controlled by experienced dance teachers who'd worked with the children for a long time. There were teachers from the schools who would accompany them, and the children would be dancing in very clearly defined areas so that they didn't get mixed up with general audience, and there were lots of parents, etc., etc. Also, what we did insist on was that the teachers who were involved with the kids, that they did their own risk assessment, and this is theirs. So they also provided a risk assessment regarding just what they were doing. So you can have different levels of risk assessment. And one of the main ones to look at here was the public liability insurance and DBS checks, that those were available and in date for the adults who were specifically responsible for children. So, I mean, they've covered very similar things, although this is, personal injury to the children because they're dancing, but they need to warm up and they were properly rehearsed, and there would be a practice in this on site as well. So, I mean, basically, you can see this is really just common sense. But you need to think about it and make allowances for it. So that was quite a long one. And then we had spoken word events that were happening in the Turner. Again, this is a very, very simple one. Slips, trips and falls, fire, electric shock. An unusual one is falls from the riser, because the speakers were sitting on a riser. Now, the riser is only 1/2 foot high and does not require barriers. If I think it gets to over 1 foot or 1.5 feet, you need to have railings. So it adds to your costs of hiring this kind of thing. So much easier just to have low risers, so you don't need to have that kind of thing and increase your costs. And I always, wherever there's a riser, I like to mark the edges in white. Just get some white gaffer tape or some white PVC tape and mark the edges so everybody can see where the edges are very easily. You could use fluorescent tape. I mean, it depends on the sort of formality of the event. I mean, if you're having a super formal interview with somebody, you probably want to use white. But if it was less formal, go for the green fluorescence. But as long as you do something like that, you're taking your risk to a low risk. One thing that was particularly of interest in the Turner was spilled drinks, because that could damage their rather lovely floor and create a slip problem. And the idea to mitigate that, we just made sure that we knew where they could access a spill kit. I mean, a spill kit could be as simple as a roll of blue roll, but we made sure that the gallery staff and the volunteers knew where they could get something if there was a spilled drink. Virgin Territories. Now, I didn't do this one. This was provided by the people who were doing Virgin Territories. So they've got an explanation, the dates, what the risk, who might be at risk, current controls, and so theirs looks slightly different to mine. So they've got a likelihood rating of unlikely, likelihood almost certain, likely, possible, unlikely, rare. Oh, sorry, unlikely and rare, yes. And then their impact would be insignificant, minor, moderate, major, severe. So they've got 5 levels. I've only used 3 levels in what I've explained to you, but they've used 5 levels because I think what they were doing was a little bit more risky, so they felt the need to do 5 levels of possible risk. One thing I wanted to point out here was injury from electrical equipment, so lighting, portable music players, etc. If you are using an electrical equipment, it's not 100% compulsory, but it's very good practice to make sure your things are pat tested. There's a couple of people in our area, Thanet, who does it, Matt Smythe in Ramsgate. He does pat testing. It's not terribly expensive. I think he charges something like £20–25 for a call out, and then £1 per item to be tested. So several of you could get together, call him out once, and then just line up all the gear for him to test. I know if you're going to do anything in the Turner, you have to do it, even though it's not a legal requirement. They won't let you do anything if you haven't pat tested all your equipment. It's a very good idea to do it, because I did pat test a whole bunch of stuff and found a couple of things which weren't kosher, so I knew not to use those bits of kit. United Mothers was another interesting one, because they used quite a lot of food. Again, they also had a 1 to 5 level of likelihood and a 1 to 5 level of severity. Let's see if there's anything quite interesting. They actually put a column in here where they go, likelihood was 1, severity is 1, so the risk is 1, which is low. Here they had a risk level of 4, tripping on electrical wires. Slips, trips and falls, always put that in. And then they still felt that it was a little bit high, so they were going to have a first aider, made sure there's a first aider on site. First aiders, especially if you're doing outdoor things, first aiders get you out of a lot of corners. Always good to have a first aider around. So did they have anything particularly interested? Oh, this is a bit more interesting. Dehydration for the performers. Make sure you have bottled water. Done. Bang. You've thought about them. That is a risk to them. Make sure there's enough water. Food allergies. Here we've got any cakes and biscuits supplied will be without nuts, definitely. Clear signs will be displayed alongside cakes and biscuits with a full list of ingredients. And food is all cooked under the insurance and certification of Annie Nichols, and certificates can be provided. So if you are doing any food, please use somebody who's got the proper food hygiene certificates, and definitely leave major allergens out. That's quite a high risk, because actually, if people do eat something that they shouldn't eat, it's a very high risk to them. So your controls are just don't have meat and don't have nuts, don't use things that people could die from, basically. Fairly simple. Oh, this is an interesting one. Safeguarding and sensitivity regarding photography. Obviously, it's if there's any children around, you want to try not to get faces, and if you do, you really want permission from parents. What you can do if you're filming with children is, you can, obviously written permission would be great, but you can also just film them saying, yes, it's okay to use my children's images, and then make sure you keep those, when you edit, just keep that snippet of film giving permission, keep that, because it'll get you out of trouble later if you need to. And you really do need to put signage around to make sure that people are aware that there's going to be filming. So at any doors, make sure people can see that you are going to be filming. So I know this is dragging on, so I'm going to go now to an example of a COVID risk assessment. So this was one that I did very recently for the Ramsgate Festival of Sound, which we were very lucky. Oh God, sorry, I didn't mean to do quite that. So this is the Ramsgate Festival of Sound. 20th of August was the date that I did this, and which was interesting. The date was very, very important. First of all, because everything changed yesterday, so this is now completely out of date. But when the council argued with me about the inadequacy of my risk assessment, they were basing their assessment of my risk assessment on information that changed on the 14th of August. So they hadn't updated their own guidelines. So it was very interesting to me that I had to point out to them, it's like guidelines have changed. And so what I did, I put some notes. I wouldn't always put notes, but I did put notes on this one. It said, note, we are currently in stage 4 of the government's 5-stage roadmap for the return of professional performing arts, which was true, and we're still in that stage, weirdly, even though we've got new restrictions. So because I needed this to be approved by the council, I made sure that I was giving them the information that I was basing this on to make sure that they actually checked. So stage 4 allows for performances indoors or outdoors, but with limited distance audience indoors. Now that implies that an outdoor event doesn't actually need any restrictions or limiting. However, we are taking it a step further and are adhering to the distance protocols outdoors. So we did stuff in Vale Square. We had chairs and tables. We had white lines drawn in the grass so that people knew where their bubbles were. People were very good. The only time they got up was to go to the loo or go to the bar. And I made sure that I put the links in that I based my stuff on so that they could, like, look, here's the evidence of what we're doing is correct. Because I mean, it's really hard to find definitive guidance about COVID, despite all the guidance available. Not all of it is definitive. So I made sure that I gave them the information that I was basing stuff on. The HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, they actually have an example of a COVID risk assessment in the workplace, and I drew a lot of my information from that because it gives you ideas of things that you should think about by looking at other people's risk assessments. So just Google all the time and find stuff that's that you can not really copy and paste, but I mean you can copy and paste like some of the words, like the headings. Like here I copied and pasted getting or spreading coronavirus by not washing hands. You can copy and paste that kind of thing, but then you've got to make sure that your stuff that you are doing to mitigate the problem is relevant to your event and that it's true. I can't emphasize how much that it has to be true, because I wrote in this risk assessment that we're going to put white lines around the chairs, And by this, we did 2 Sundays. The first Sunday we did, and then by the second Sunday, some of the lines were out of date, or we rearranged some of the furniture. And we would say, oh, do we really need to do more white lines? It's like, yes, we do, because we put it in the risk assessment that we were going to do white lines. So if you say you're going to do it, you really must actually do it. So this is stuff that you're all going to have to do. So I'm sorry, I know time is ticking, and I know this is getting very dull by this time. But I just want to make sure that you've sort of got this together. So getting or spreading coronavirus by not washing hands, everybody basically. Ensure your hand sanitizer is available on every table, dotted around the deck chairs, backstage and in staff working positions. So we've accommodated everybody there. Tabletops, chairs and other surfaces to be cleaned with antiviral spray before each event, and create signage reminding people to clean their hands. Now the first time they rejected it was basically because I hadn't put enough signage in. So yes, you need to put signage everywhere. And you can download signs. You can just download them and print them yourself, or you can order them if you need something that's a bit more sturdy than an A4 printed piece of paper. But yeah, you can get them everywhere. It's not hard to find. Getting or spreading coronavirus in areas where social distancing is difficult. Again, everybody. Social distancing is built into the layout of the audience seating with wide walkways to access the bar. We literally had 2-meter walkways everywhere. Each set of table and chairs will be marked with a white line into a bubble, and the event takes place out of doors, which naturally reduces possibilities of transmission. Still, this is a medium risk, so we then added signage will be in place to remind people of social distancing rules. Signs will be placed on the outer perimeter as well as inside, and volunteers will advise people at all times to observe social distancing. And then we can reduce our risk to low. What we also did, because it was a performance, we had the compere who was running in between all the acts. They were really, really good, and they were reminding people. It just made fun out of it. You can make it really, really fun. We did a Saturday evening event, which was outdoors there were no barriers. It was completely free on the beachfront. So we had actors there, in a rather fun costume, and they were there with feather dusters telling people, I don't know, something, let's not fluster, don't make a cluster. So we made it fun, and people walked, people all get too close together, and they would go and ask people to stand further apart. So you can do things like that makes it fun and helps people do the right thing. Face-to-face interaction at the bar. We based what we did on what pubs are doing, which is maintain 2-meter distance between those serving and the clients. And we actually marked out the queue. There were 2 bars, so that was the queue for that bar, that was the queue for that bar, and with a big space in between 2 queues. Done. Contact with other audience members, spreading coronavirus, blah, blah. Again, repeat. Just repeat yourself. Each table and deck chair is clustered in pre-booked groups, so we knew exactly who was coming and where they were going to sit, and that was their space. The area has been thoroughly measured out. Each of the tables and chairs will be enclosed in a bubble. The compere staff and volunteers will encourage the audience to stay within their allocated area. We also had security on hand to ensure the rules are adhered to. Luckily, we never needed to use them. I think it's always better to use a friendly volunteer or a friendly person on stage to ask people to do things rather than security. Only use security when you really have to, but that's what they're there for. There's a one-way system in place for entry and exits. The council were really hot on having one way in and one way out. And audiences will be asked to stay in their bubble unless going to the bar. A very important one for any kind of performance. Getting or spreading coronavirus by the use of microphones. Now, any of you who are performers, you will know that, you just walk up to any old microphone and use it. This is not the done thing anymore. So what we had to do was make sure that every performer had their own microphone that only they used, that was pre-cleaned, and that had their name labeled on it, and only they touched it. So very important, if you are using any microphones, you just have to hire more. If you've got lots of people using them, hire more. They're not expensive. And yeah, only the sound crew were to handle the actual microphones to get them in place. They needed to either sanitize immediately before or use fresh gloves. And we had 2 sound crew. We could probably have got away with only 1 sound person. But we had 2 working each day because one person was going to deal with knobbly twiddling the knobs on the desk, and the other person was going to deal with stage stuff. So we could limit how much stuff everybody touched. So yes, that's pretty much one last thing about performances. What we did, we had the busk at dusk. We had 3 people busking at the top of the cliff, 8 people at the bottom, and counterintuitively, we included very long periods of silence in between various acts so that people would wander off. And also with the buskers, we had 4 of the 8 buskers performing at once so that you would split the audience. And it worked, it really worked. All the videos you see of it, social distancing was great, but we made sure that there was enough going on. So there was 1 person up top and 4 people below. So we had 5 acts at once, and then long silences so that people would either wander off or at least they were really split up between all the performances. And it worked, and it was really safe. And yeah, we were really, really pleased with how that worked. Right, I think I'm going to stop there because I think we've kind of done enough. Lovely to see everybody. Thank you for coming, and good luck doing risk assessments. And if you do need help at the time, you know, I will be available to give advice and give you a hand. I'm not doing them for you, but I will help you.